Good morning, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center for today's program, Governing the Far North, Assessing Cooperation Between Arctic and Non-Arctic Nations. My name is David Biep, and I direct the Canada Institute's the Wilson Center, and it's my pleasure to have you here today, some many familiar faces and many new faces. I'd like to extend a special welcome to those of you watching via webcast, either today in real time or in the future. We will post a summary of the event soon, and this webcast will be archived on the Wilson Center website in the coming days. I'm also pleased to note that this program will be repeated with one or two substitutions among our speakers in Ottawa tomorrow afternoon, September 22nd, at the University of Ottawa. I'm also very happy to have been able to work with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for this event. Pia Bungarten and her staff here in Washington and in Ottawa have been wonderful colleagues and true collaborators. For those of you unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is the United States memorial to Woodrow Wilson. It was founded in 1968 as a living memorial to our only president with a PhD, to bridge the policy world and the academic world. The center has 22 programs looking at different parts of the world and at major issues facing public policy. It also hosts more than 50 scholars in residence at any one time. And the Canada Institute is an integral program of the center. We work to increase awareness and knowledge about Canada and Canada-U.S. issues among policymakers and opinion leaders. We were founded in 2001. The primary focus of our efforts are energy and environment, trade, borders, and border security, which I think are all combined when we look at issues such as the Arctic. Coming up next month, we have a program on October 6th evaluating Canadian and U.S. power in the 21st century through two books, Lament for America, Decline of the Superpower, Plan for Renewal by Earl Fry, and The Canadian Century, Moving Out of America's Shadow by Brian Lee Crowley. And on October 19th, we take a look at Canada's role in developing post-September 11th border security policies. Information on these and other programs is available at our website. And please sign up for our fortnightly brief email newsletter. I'd like to thank our Wilson Center colleagues in the Kennan Institute, which looks at issues affecting Russia and other successor states to the Soviet Union, and the Environmental Change and Security Program for their assistance with today's program. And lastly, I would like to express our gratitude to the Canadian Embassy here in Washington, and especially to Hugues Rousseau, Minister, Counselor, Political, for their support of today's program. And now I would like to turn the microphone over to Pia for a few words of welcome. Thank you and enjoy today's program. Welcome, Pia.
Thank you very, very much, David, and a welcome from me as well to our conference. David asked me to briefly introduce the foundation. I'd be glad to do it. I think some of you know the Friedrich Ebert Foundation already. Those of you who don't will have this conference as a very good guide to the kind of work that we do. Our name, Friedrich Ebert, gives you some information about our origin and our politics. Friedrich Ebert was Germany's first democratically elected president. He became president after World War I and had the very difficult task of leading a defeated nation. He was a social democrat who had risen from very humble origins to this very important position. And Friedrich Ebert has been called the Abraham Lincoln of German politics. We are a political foundation, meaning that we are close to one of Germany's political parties, which is the Social Democratic Party, but we maintain complete independence when it comes to our finances, our personnel, and our policies. We have, for the past decades, and continue to give scholarships. We do policy analysis, policy conferences like these ones in Germany. We have our headquarters in Bonn and in Berlin, and we have 13 offices there. And we have, around the world, a network of offices, and Washington and Ottawa are part of this network of over 100 offices. We take up a wide range of issues, international, political, economic, social issues, and we work on international cooperation wherever possible together with partner organizations like the Wilson Center. And I think that was a wonderful experience for us. I would like to thank you, David, Chris, and also Laura Pedro for the really, truly excellent cooperation on this seminar. It was a great pleasure from day one. The topic of this center, of our conference today, I don't think needs much introduction. you know that the Arctic region is of rising interest to many people because of climate change. It seems to be that climate change is here to stay, and with it, new things become possible, including the access to resources that were beyond reach for a long time, and shipping routes that earlier generations only dreamed about. But because of this, there are also now worries that earlier generations did not have, such as the question of the competition for resources. And you may remember some mishaps that happened not so long ago. Some ships, one tourist ship that ran into trouble, and then also an oil tanker that ran into trouble. And luckily nothing happened, but it made people aware of the new hazards that now also need to be confronted. To us as a foundation, political dialogue is the main instrument of our work. It's the goal of our work. And this conference is built on the idea that the Arctic nations are in the process of rethinking their policies, including the form in which they cooperate to deal with all of these new possibilities and these new issues. But due to the huge impact of climate change in the Arctic region, non-Arctic nations also face new possibilities, new challenges, and this conference will look at the way in which non-Arctic and Arctic nations might cooperate, and the way in which non-Arctic nations can bring their expertise to the table. I hope that this will strengthen the exchange of political leaders and experts that is vital to making cooperation in the Arctic a model for the world on how to deal with the new issues that arise from climate change. Before I turn over now to Don Newman, let me briefly introduce Franz Tönnis. He is a German member of parliament, and he's been in the German parliament since 1994, which means that he survived the rather difficult, to put it mildly, elections of the Social Democrats in 2009. That's quite an accomplishment, but it's not the only one to his name. He was the parliamentary state secretary in the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, and what he brings to this conference is his many years of experience in the efforts of the Baltic nations to cooperate, which I think is a very valuable focus, because it allows us to bring lessons learned to this process as well. Thanks very much for your patience. I hope this is going to be a productive meeting. And now I turn over to Don Newman. Thanks, Don.
Thank you, Pia, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, panel. Our first panel today is cooperation among Arctic nations, and we are going to discuss that for about an hour and a half. At some point, we'll open it up to the floor if you have questions or comments. You have in your material the biographies of the panelists, so I will completely inadequately introduce them and give you a very brief idea of who they are. Betsy Baker is an associate professor at the Vermont Law School, which she made very clear to me last night is not part of the University of Vermont, and I want to make that clear to everybody so that I'm in Betsy's good books. She attended the 2007 Arctic Science Summit week, and that led to a new experience for her. She became part of the crew of the United States Coast Guard cutter Healy in both 2008 and 2009, and was sailing up in the Northwest Passage. Her Arctic research involves improving legal access for scientific research, Canadian-U.S. offshore oil and gas regulation, federal indigenous relations, and integrated ecosystem-based management in the Beaufort Sea. Danila Bolkavev is a fellow with the East-West Institute Global Security Team. He's based in Brussels. He's an expert on EU-Russia relations and worked on Arctic and Central Asian affairs at the European Parliament. He is a native Russian speaker, but luckily for us, he's fluent in both French but also in English. And Joël Plouffe is a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Quebec at Montreal and a visiting scholar in Quebec studies at Western Washington University. His PhD thesis deals with the objectives and implications of U.S. Arctic policy with a focus on geopolitics and security issues in the far north. I think the way we'll proceed, each of the panelists will have a 10-minute presentation, some with PowerPoint, and at the conclusion of the 10 minutes, we will then begin our discussion up here. I just want to remind the panelists that 10 minutes is more than 9 minutes, but it is less than 11 minutes, and we should keep that in mind as we proceed. Why don't I start here and just move down the line? Betsy Baker, would you go first?
Will my presentation be put up? And the slide that's being put up for you, it will show the extent of the sea ice minimum this month. And It surprised us. It first was announced as being on the 10th by the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and it's been receding since then, so we have slightly different figures. The 30-year average is roughly something more like that, just to give you some sense of the extent of the retreat. But thank you to the Wilson Center and to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for the chance to be here this morning. 10 minutes, 3 questions we were given. For all 3 questions, I'd emphasize that an essential element to cooperation is the need for transparency and the sharing of scientific data and other information. Question 1, where is the U.S. currently engaged in cooperation with Arctic nations? A short and very partial answer is shipping, emergency response, science, seabed mapping. Partial answer. I'll focus on cooperation at the national government level, but also touch on cooperation at other levels, such as between different subsistence user groups, between states and the provincial, territorial level. But at all levels of cooperation, a great deal of the activity is geared toward finding solutions to the practical and pressing problems facing the Arctic as a whole. There's not a lot of theorizing. There is a lot of hands-on work. For example, joint contingency planning between Coast Guards bilaterally and multilaterally, joint military exercises such as the U.S. and Denmark participating for the first time this year in Operation Nanook in the Canadian Arctic. Beyond such military cooperation, much of the U.S. government-level cooperation does take place within the framework of the Arctic Council, which is, of course, the primary forum for Arctic concerns and grows itself out of scientific cooperation. It was established 14 years ago this week, on September 19th, 1996, the signing of the Ottawa Declaration, emerged from about 7 years of cooperation under the Arctic Environment Protection Strategy, again, very science-based, practical problem-solving. Secretary of State Clinton has called for the strengthening of the Arctic Council, and for our purposes today, 2 things are worth noting. The Council does not create binding obligations for its members yet. It is self-described as a, quote, high-level forum to provide a means for promoting cooperation, coordination, interaction among the Arctic states with the involvement of the Arctic indigenous communities and other Arctic inhabitants on common Arctic issues. This declaration specified that military security is not to be dealt with by the Council. And I say it does not yet create binding obligations because there are some indications that the countries are ready to consider that step in very narrow areas such as emergency response, rescue infrastructure. Second thing worth noting about the Council is its composition, unique in multilateral fora, and that representatives of the indigenous populations sit at the same table, albeit with voting power for the member states only. I will assume you know the 8 member states of the Arctic. I won't assume you know who the permanent participants are. And as I read the names, keep them in mind for a map we'll look at in a few minutes. The Aleut International Association, the Arctic Athabascan Council, the Gwich'in Council International, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, and the Sami Council. And if you break these groups down by population rather than by national boundary, one example is approximately 160,000 Inuit living in the Arctic regions of Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Chukotka, Russia. And I can provide more statistics in our discussion. There are also observers. Currently, Germany, Netherlands, Poland, and the UK have the formal status as observers, as do several NGOs. In discussion, we can talk about the process of applications by Japan and the EU, others, for an observer status. And just one example of a successful bilateral agreement at the sub-national level, again, all of this to be elaborated upon in discussion if desired, is an 1988 Inuvialuit-Inupiat Polar Bear Management Agreement in the southern Beaufort Sea between Inuit on either side of the U.S.-Canada border. Sets hunting season and other management parameters, an example of a fairly successful cooperation there. Science, we can talk science in the discussion, but just to mention the International Polar Year with literally thousands of cooperative projects between Arctic and non-Arctic scientists, and the plans for a sustained Arctic observing network around the Arctic. Science also has a role to play in diplomacy. I will return to that. The second question. How well do existing governing structures address Arctic economic, security, and environmental issues? And, as if that weren't enough in one question, what type of governing structure would the U.S. prefer? Again, these were questions given to us. First, I would at least pose the possibility that security and environmental concerns are intimately related, and we can revisit this in the discussion, but the U.S. Navy roadmap for the Arctic, for example, the U.S. Arctic region policy make this connection clear. But taking the question on its terms, how well do existing governance structures address economic, security, and environmental issues? I would say depends on whose economy, security, and environment you're talking about. So my next slide shows industrial development in the Arctic. And I put that on a slant so that you would be made aware of the grid arendal sources of maps. It's a wonderful source of maps for Arctic and other areas, a UNEP project. So if you're talking about industrial interests such as oil and gas and mining and extractive industries, national governing structures in each state are the most significant and, of course, vary from one Arctic state to the next. A question for discussion is the extent to which these practices might be usefully harmonized using instruments such as the Arctic Council offshore oil and gas guidelines. If you're talking instead about shipping, the International Maritime Organization has been a fairly successful forum for the states to have rules in place for such things as disposal of waste at sea, training of crew. We're working solely toward Arctic-specific polar code for construction of ice-capable vessels. And Timo Koivirova, who will speak to you this afternoon, or this second session, has done a great piece of work, the WWF gap analysis on where pieces are and aren't working. On the other hand, if you are, we'll just do it that way, talking about economy, security, and environment of the indigenous residents, you're talking about very different concerns. We've already, think about tourists showing up where there's no infrastructure, no hotels, no hospitals. Oil and gas development, well, there's not a monolithic view in any Native Alaskan community or a Nunavut village about whether oil and gas should be further developed in the Beaufort Sea, for example. There is a sense that consultation between the state, developers, and the communities could be done more effectively and continue throughout the life of a project. Or, if you're talking about the economy, security, and environment of the regional, oblast, provincial, or state administrative bodies, you might have yet different concerns. And here I would ask you to take a quick tour of mental images, the vastly different areas of the Arctic. Parts are heavily industrialized, parts are pristine. Move from Murmansk, an industrial town, to Rovaniemi with a university, Tromsø, Norway, also a university town, Nikolukta, a small Sami settlement in Lapland with not much going on besides reindeer herding, Reykjavik and its urban culture, aluminum plants in Iceland, Nuuk, Greenland, the Scandinavian model of a green oil and gas economy is part of their vision. Iqaluit in Nunavut and Barrow in Alaska are relatively impoverished by comparison to most of these other places. Briefly, what type of governing structure would the U.S. prefer? I've already mentioned indications that there is a desire for certain obligations to be binding. Under the Arctic Council, I'm sure we'll talk about, is the Antarctic Treaty a model? The answer is clearly no. We don't need an overarching system, at least from our government representatives, that existing treaties can be woven together. The last question, and I hope I'm keeping under 11 minutes, is it possible to demonstrate a governance approach that results in mutual gain and sets a precedent for international cooperation? 3 points: clear self-interest, bottom-up governance, and science-based diplomacy. Self-interest is the best motive for entering into cooperative arrangements. If you have no vested interest in the outcome, cooperation will not work. Bottom-up, governing structures closest to the end users, I believe, do the best job of preserving their economic, security, and environmental interests. And the trick is to get the higher-up levels of governance to recognize that their stability and security depends on stability and security at those lower levels. And I can talk about an example in the Beaufort Sea, an integrated management plan initiative that involved all players from the get-go and is viewed as a fairly effective form of cooperation. And lastly, science-based diplomacy. This is an example of data that was put together by scientists from around the pole, the International Bathymetric Chart. of the Arctic Ocean in preparation for the Article 76 process under the Law of the Sea Convention. That's the article that defines where you locate the continental shelf, how you can measure the extent of your shelf, which, of course, all coastal states around the world are actively engaged in. I would argue that the science and the treaty basis for cooperation is really what has driven things like this month's Russian-Norwegian settlement of a 40-year maritime boundary dispute, a governance approach that has resulted in mutual gain and sets a precedent for cooperation. Mutual gain through this agreement increased certainty on jurisdiction over what was a previously disputed area, cooperation on the management of fishery resources, agreement on how to handle situations when a hydrocarbon field crosses the agreed boundary. And obviously there are lessons here for the current diplomatic discussions between Ottawa and Canada regarding their dispute of territory in the Beaufort Sea. And the driver for both the Norwegian-Russian boundary settlement and this current Beaufort Sea discussion is clearly the treaty process outlined in the Convention on the Law of the Sea. As the countries involved gathered scientific data for their submissions to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, they learned more about what was there, what are the resources. And now that we know, we can have more readiness to settle the dispute. And Norway and Russia have shown what the media likes to ignore. There is, in fact, no unregulated race for the Arctic. Indeed, there's considerable cooperation. And I just have to show this picture because I love it. And it shows the Canadian icebreaker and the U.S. icebreaker out working actually 2 summers ago in the Beaufort Sea. Scientists working around the clock on board to gather data for the continental shelf submission, but also learning a lot more about other projects that were being researched at the time. Recent news reports about Canada's and Russia's potential overlap of continental shelf on the Lomonosov Ridge is something we might also want to discuss. But both countries have made clear that they will abide by what the Commission basically confirms with respect to their science. And as long as the scientific data is made available and transparent, there's a good informed basis for cooperation. So I will close with that observation and hopefully have kept under my 11 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've set a good example for the panel. Yes, you did very well. Danila, would you go next, please?
Thank you very much for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity of presenting at Woodrow Wilson Center. I would address, hopefully in 10 minutes, major trends in Russian Arctic policy, basically which dates back already for almost 90 years. So that's, basically like a short overview of major milestones of development of Russian interests in the Arctic, which started, it's just before the First World War, with Russian Navy, sent to explore a Northern Sea route, and first territorial claim, was made in 1916. Around the years of 26, 24, 25, it was U.S., Canada, and Soviet Union used like sectorial principle to put the territorial claims for the land mass inside this triangle. Like decision of Soviet government of 1926 was basically any land mass between North Pole and the east and west points of Soviet territory was declared Soviet. Obviously, at this point, it was purely theoretical discussion. There was no technical means of going further. Basically, for almost 50, 60 years during the Cold War, nothing much was happening. It was like heavily militarized area used mostly for submarines, but not much development outside of the South Arctic for the gas was happening until fall of the Soviet Union and Russia ratification of UNCLOS in 1997. So using what's basically was a member on the panel which was deciding on the scientific data, Russia made first claim of extending its continental shelf under the Article 76, which was mentioned by Betsy in 2001. But data gathered at this point wasn't really significant, and the first claim was rejected. And I think I would put the year of 2001 as start of real interest in the Arctic affairs among Russian officials and Russian public. I mean, so starting from the year 2001, Russia took Arctic really seriously and started to gather data to be presented in UNCLOS. So 2007 basically was a famous expedition chaired by Artur Chilingarov, special envoy of the president for the Arctic affairs and famous polar scientist. Together the data was Lomonosov and Mendeleev ridges, extensions of Siberian platform. In May 2001, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov participated in the Greenland summit of A5. A5 is like 5 major Arctic nations. I mean, basically was agreed what all the instruments already are in place, such as Arctic Council, the Convention, UN Convention of the Sea, and this is sufficient for the governing of the Arctic. I mean, that's basically the idea, like why the summit was A5. What's the, if you consider the UNCLOS, I consider the inner, like the upper Arctic, it's mostly concerns five countries: Denmark, US, Canada, and Russia. As only these countries has basically their continental shelves like accessing the Arctic Ocean. In September 2001, 2008, the Russian policy on all this Russian policy interest was gathered together in the same document, and Security Council of Russian Federation set these key priorities in the state Arctic policy till 2020. So why Arctic is important for Russia? Basically, Russia sees, I mean, the interests, like the growing interest towards Arctic in Russia is basically explained by climate change, which is both a challenge and opportunity. It opens new prospects for development hydrocarbon deposits, but it also opens a border which was naturally protected before. So it's an economic engine. It's estimated what's around 11% of GDP. Like Russian GDP is being produced in the high north, and it's mostly, of course, gas, oil, and rare metals development in the adjacent to the Arctic Ocean regions, and it contributes up to 22% of the growth, depending on the estimates. So it's also like important resource base. It was recently underlined in the Yamal development strategy. So it's around 80% of all discovered gas potential is in the Arctic. It's also important deposit of other mineral and biological resources. It gets, I mean, with global warming, it gets access to the 3 oceans, and it's also very important security issue for Russians. It's a base of the most modern, and I think the only modern Russian fleet, Northern Fleet, where around 65% of all strategic submarines are based. And of course, that's basically an important argument against important argument of Russia against any treaty which will resemble Antarctic Treaty. So basically, it's a very important security and sovereign point of view. It's also a very important transport corridor. Like the Northern Sea route reduces the distance, for instance, between Rotterdam and Japan by 1/3. And I think just 3 weeks ago, I was the first Russian independent gas producer, Novatek, made the first attempt of bringing a tanker with gas condensate from Murmansk to China using this Northern Sea route and with one icebreaker. So they transported around 70,000 tons of gas condensate to China, southern China, which went all well, I mean, let's say, and then they saved around 2 weeks of time. So basically, as I already mentioned, it's also an important issue of protecting an extensive borderline. It's over 17,000 kilometers. This wasn't an issue up till now. I mean, and then basically that's the main issue, like which is that becomes the main issue with opening of the Northern Sea route. I mean, it's an opening of free access to these territories. So basically, this is a multilateral cooperation in the Arctic, declared Russian priorities. Basically, Russia is the member of all major international organizations there, such as the Arctic Council or Barents Euro-Atlantic Council. So the principle was declared of setting up all delimitation agreements. One, it was settled on 15th of September when President Medvedev and Stoltenberg Jr. signed an agreement of delimitation line between Norway and Russia in the Barents Sea. It's one, this being, signed, but Russian Duma has to still ratify it between U.S. and Russia. Using the principle of 1867 agreement when Alaska was ceded to the United States. And Canadian, as Betsy already mentioned, the decision of the limitation between Canada and Russia would be always treated according position of foreign ministry, using the United Nations law of the sea principles. Basically, the goals of protecting the indigenous population and environment protection were declared, but not that much going on, not that much as it should be going on. But for instance, the cooperation of practical cooperation of the ground, prevented technological disasters, and search and rescue. Are quite important. There is very, very strong cooperation between U.S. and Russia on search and rescue, and Russia supported U.S. in recent U.S. initiative on search and rescue operations in the Arctic Council. So now we are basically outlining the current and potential issues of concern for Russia. In the High North. The major issue of concern, as I think for Russians as well as possibly for Canadians, it's excessive internationalization of the Arctic. So that's why Russian official position is what the current mechanisms, legal mechanisms, political mechanisms are entirely sufficient for cooperation. And that's resulted, for instance, in vetoing EU demand to become an observer. This was a move which basically was same position was shared by Canada. So Canadian and Russian officials made it clear they don't want EU, even as observer in the Arctic Council. An issue of claim, an issue of interest of obviously is the delimitation of the continental shelf and overlapping extension claims. It's still not really clear whether Mendeleev Ranges and Lomonosov Ranges, belongs to Russian continental platform or to Canadian one, and that's possibly would be extremely difficult to prove, one way or another, and that might be an issue of concern. As already mentioned, it's border protection and militarization. So basically, NATO's interests, driven by Secretary General of NATO Rasmussen, to go to the Arctic is basically makes Russians quite nervous. And obviously, it's also a very important issue. So possible future challenges to the sovereignty of Northern Sea route. So under the law of the sea, most of the parts of the Northern Sea route is considered to be legally as high seas. But we're still regulated due to the specific environment and safety concerns by a specific legislation, which called on the inner sea waters. So Russia considers Northern Sea route as inner sea waters, in its territorial sea. And then let's say that's possibly a future issue of concern of certain tensions. The issue that I mentioned, despite nobody really talks about this, it's a delimitation between U.S. and Russia in the Bering Sea. Russian Parliament still didn't ratify the 1990 agreement of delimitation, and there are different divergent points of view of this. It's a part of political game. It also depends whether U.S. and when U.S. will ratify UNCLOS, and whether the division line between U.S. and Russia and the Arctic would be accepted as the line which divides their continental shelf. Because once in 1867, when Russian Empire ceded Alaska to the U.S., it was decided on the border. It's the line, which goes, along the meridian, and divides the territory between U.S. and Russia. Whether it would be accepted as a line of division for continental shelf, we shall see. And it's also economic activities in Svalbard. 200-mile zone, where Russian and Norwegian interests are still different. When Russia is pressing for continental shelf not being part of sovereign Norwegian continental shelf. Basically, this is just to outline, I mean, Russian state Arctic policy priorities. So it's Arctic is the main resource base. It's also put a specific emphasis on sustainable use of natural resources. Third most important point is development of transport routes. I mean, basically an open sea route as a commercial as a commercial viable transport solution. It's a border protection infrastructure, and it's still very important national security imperative, as mostly like region being a base of Northern Sea Fleet. Basically, just to outline, let's say, like Arctic potential and shortcomings. I mean, Russia has quite an impressive like infrastructure, especially like maritime, but mostly inherited from Soviet Union, and quite an impressive geological and geographic knowledge of the Arctic. But still, what lacks, especially in industrial development, that's industrial know-how, how to develop offshore oil and gas deposits, and sufficient investment is lacking. And then we shall see, I mean, let's say, how Yamal program of development of the High North would be implemented. And still, border protection and territorial control issues is a matter of concern. And finishing now with questions for the future. Right now, official positions the law of the sea is the only legal source for the Arctic, but this position of the Foreign Office is being challenged by a number of Russian lawyers, saying what Russian claims for extension of continental shelf should be backed by other sources of the law. Which governance for the Arctic? I mean, whether like the existing mechanism would be enough, and then Russia stick to a cooperation in the Barents Euro-Atlantic Council and Arctic Council. How to deal with a third country's presence? Russia didn't voice it officially, but obviously Russia doesn't want to see anyone outside A5 or outside the Arctic Council to be actively present in the High North. And basically how U.S.-Russia primarily, but also EU-Russia relations would impact development in the Arctic. So would it be possible to basically to spread this positive experience, positive momentum with Norway to the relation with U.S. or not in the future? I mean, that's I think with 3-4 critical questions we might discuss later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Joël?
Thank you. I won't bring a PowerPoint, but I'll bring my watch and I'll try to do this. I know if I have slides, I'll be here for the rest of the day and start commenting them. So I'll try to be brief. Thank you very much to the co-sponsors for inviting me. Bonjour aux francophones dans la salle. I am very happy to be here and very honored to be with such a distinguished participants in the panels today and for tomorrow also. I was asked to look mostly on Canada and Canada in the Arctic, and thinking about this in the last weeks, I said, well, why not look at Canada's foreign policy in the Arctic? That was published recently, and without presenting it in detail to you, we won't have time for that, and there's many things to look at in that policy, is to try to take out from it what is the thematic of the discussion today, which is international cooperation and governance. What is this new, or not new, but mostly new document, which goes back to Northern Strategy of Canada, which was published last year. It is promoting four commonly known pillars: sovereignty for Canada, exercising sovereignty in the Great North, and Betsy was very clear on that a while ago, on saying that territories are not the same across the Arctic region, and in Canada, its geography is enormous, and exercising sovereignty in that region is Canada's first priority. Promoting economic and social development in that region, protecting the Arctic environment, and improving and developing governance. There's nothing revolutionary in here. This is traditional Canadian policy in the Arctic. But once again, what we have here is a almost 30-page document which states these, comes back on these, and goes into a bit more detail and creates a sort of a backgrounder on Canadian policy in the Arctic. It is very clear in this, and this is in continuity with Canada's policy. Cooperation will continue. Canada, like you all know, was one of the leading states that created the Arctic Council with its allies with Norway, with Finland. Canada has always cooperated in the North. It's part of its national interest. But it also reaffirms in this document many engagements that Canada has done in the region for the last almost 20 years now with its allies, and that it will continue to go this way. There is also a sous-entendu in this policy. There's a political willingness that maybe did not exist before. That's always discutable, and we can discuss about this later on. But it reminds Canadians also that there is Canadian responsibilities and opportunities in this huge region, notably in North America, in the North American Arctic, which has been maybe overshadowed or overlooked before, that is becoming something Canada wants to look at. So the first point I would like to bring to the table today is this policy really highlights the importance of U.S.-Canada relations in the North American Arctic. The second one is, of course, the broader, more geopolitical aspect of Canada foreign policy in the region, which is historically important international cooperation with Arctic and non-Arctic states. I'll get back to that. And what's interesting with this policy also, if we go beyond the national rhetoric in the media and with other government officials who often have an alarmist approach to Arctic geopolitics and the relationships between Arctic states, this policy is a bit clearer on that and is a lot more pragmatic and less alarmist than things that we usually hear at the news at 6 o'clock. There have been many critics, many observations on this, and like I said, there's many things to look at. I want to look at two things: Canada-U.S. relations and the international cooperation with Canada and the rest of the Arctic states and the world. The first observation that comes is in that policy we are maybe trying to fill a gap, a security gap in the North American Arctic. It is working even stronger than before with the United States in the Arctic. And I can also say it's maybe breaking a taboo, an Arctic taboo, breaking a status quo between Canada and the U.S. in the Arctic. We all know Canada and the U.S. are great partners in economic relationships, in military relationships. But because of unresolved disputes, differences in the Arctic, work in the Arctic has always been a bit complicated. And before beginning of talking of climate change, and before talking about the key word, which is access to this far north, working together becomes some kind of a very important priority here. So it's being very pragmatic with our most pragmatic neighbor, which is the United States. It is dealing with border issues, looking at, we've seen this summer, starting to talk about the Beaufort Sea issue, which has been there for a long time. We met for the first time in Ottawa, meeting in Washington next year to deal with this. Going beyond, and I can't believe to be hearing this from this government once, what many scholars have been saying for a long time, going beyond the idea of the Northwest Passage, putting it beside, because the dispute with the United States is not in this policy. We talk about the Northwest Passage, but its relationship with the United States is not mentioned. So going beyond the Northwest Passage and being more pragmatic and working on bilateral and almost multilateral cooperation. Again, having Denmark and the United States together with Canada in Canadian Arctic waters this summer is something that is setting a precedent and is very interesting for cooperation. It underlines cross-border responsibilities and possibilities working with the U.S. in this region for maybe future, not talking right now, but future cross-border their economic possibilities. At least we're setting precedents for that and opening the door. We need to start somewhere. Again, fundamental for environmental and human security also. We've been talking about a lot in the Beaufort about environmental concerns. We need to go forward with the border dispute and then try to figure out how an environmental regime could be interesting in that region for search and rescue, but also for environmental intervention. And I think the last point of this part is it is giving the first steps of a new structure between Canada and the U.S. in the North American Arctic, which did not exist before. The second point is the idea of international cooperation with Canada, with Arctic states and non-Arctic states. There is, like I said in the beginning, a continuity in here. There is Canada engaged in working with others on many projects of the Arctic Council and trying to reinforce governance in the region. That is a very important continuity that promotes regional integration and Canada in that region as an Arctic states. It makes the Arctic Council as a priority. Now, many will say if Canada makes the Arctic Council a priority, Canada has a lot of work to do also with the Arctic Council, notably bringing back the ambassador of Canada to the Arctic Council, reinforcing the secretary of the Arctic Council, and we can go further on that later on. But at the same time, see what's coming also. Canada will be chair of the Arctic Council in 2013 for 2 years. Who follows? It's the United States for another 2 years. So we have a very North American perspective on Arctic geopolitics that are coming. It encouraged further cooperation, a model here between Canada and the U.S. and the rest of the circumpolar world. It is, again, and this comes again, it's bringing indigenous interests in foreign policy. This is, of course, not very clear, but it is mentioned that U.S. Canadian indigenous peoples should take part more actively in foreign policy making. But I think we have more questions to the Canadian government on this for the years to come. And I think the biggest point, again, on this international cooperation is the question of environmental security, which has always been, with Canada, an important priority because, again, of its geography and its capabilities, low capabilities to intervene in this huge region. Yes, let's be positive on continuity, but there's also something. We cannot be satisfied with the status quo and with continuity. It's a great thing that it's going forward, but at the same time, something is not being addressed here. There's a there's another gap that's coming, and it is a question between Canada's relations with non-Arctic states. This is not being addressed, and this is not very clear. We've talked about Canada and Russia, who agree that there should not be another framework, and the other Arctic states are very agreeing on this, not another legal framework for the Arctic region. But on the other hand, with climate change and globalization and the changing of this region, it's already a globalized region, but more international interest, these questions will come up. And Canada, what is Canada's role on this? His diplomatic role. Is Canada going to play the first the first state that will intervene to bring together cooperation with Arctic and the rest of the world? Or are we just sort of creating an exclusive neighborhood, which is not very positive for international relations? I will stop on this and looking forward to discussing with all of you in the next minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joël. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Just as Joël sits down, Betsy, let me start with you. Would it be fair to say that for the Arctic nations, the law of the sea and the Arctic Council, the law of the sea is the template for resolving most of the disputes, and the Arctic Council is going forward the agency that will, in a sense, run the Arctic?
I think it's fair to say, is this on? That the Law of the Sea Convention is certainly acknowledged and promoted by the Arctic 5 and the Arctic 8 as the template. The Ilulissat Declaration, which I believe Danila referred to, specifically states, yes, that the Law of the Sea Convention is the existing framework. The U.S. Arctic Region Policy refers to it as the primary means for thinking about dispute settlement and about management generally. As to the Arctic Council, I guess there's less monolithic acceptance of that view, that there are problems with it. It doesn't always, it's sort of a cozy little club in some ways, and it does a tremendous job of providing research, cooperative, solving of problems, as I mentioned, so even just rescue infrastructure, a Russian-led initiative through the Arctic Council. But there are other voices that say we need to move beyond that because it's not able at this point to issue binding obligations.
Well, Danilo, though, could it be strengthened so that it could do all these things, and this would be the agency, or would you think a new agency had to be created? I mean, basically, there's two issues in the Arctic. One is the resources and how they're divided up amongst the border states, and the other is, at some point, transmission through the Arctic for any country that wants. So there are two issues, and the resources, it seems to me, are relatively simple. They belong to the states that border the ocean. But in terms of running the Arctic and for all countries to use it if it's going to be international waters, even if some people claim some part of it as their territorial waters, somebody's going to have to be in charge of that. And is that the Arctic Council's role if it's given that mandate? Pull down your mic.
Well, it can be dealt through IMO, for instance, International Maritime Organization. I mean, that's actually has all necessary provisions for the high seas. I mean, let's say for transportations. I mean, and it also, like, correct me, like, if Lois can correct me, also has, I think, provisions. I mean, let's say for like national legislation when some navigations can be restricted for like environment or security reasons. I mean, let's say like that's. I mean, but IMO, like generally, IMO is more enough for navigations. I mean, and right now, when there's like, for instance, for the passage, for like the law of, which regulates Northern Sea route. I mean, in Russia says, for instance, for due to the like floating ice, for instance, there needs to be specific permissions for the ships to pass, and then they have to be followed by, they have to be like accompanied by an icebreaker. But in general, I think IMO, I mean, it says more than enough for this. I mean, Arctic Council deals with very precise issues, not political. They say it's not political body. It's like has to go, I mean, it's and then deal with specific practical, and then in this it's very successful. And there's like, I don't see there's like any need, I mean, at this point, I mean, let's say, because there's enough provisions, let's say, like in international law, and then there is enough organization for this. And then for maritime affairs, it's IMO, I mean, let's say. For fisheries in the high seas, in the like the high north, I mean, let's say that might be a different issue, I mean, let's say, but that's up till now was not realistic. It's too early to tell.
All right. Well, Joel, picking up on what Betsy said, though, the Arctic Council, she says, has to be able to make regulations that are enforceable. So you could give the Arctic Council any number of different powers. You could change it. The members could take that upon themselves and agree to follow them. Is that, and in terms of both Canada and Russia wanting to limit the size of the Arctic Council, can you see that as growing in influence, or do you think that it is what it is and it's more or less going to stay that way?
Well, I would say in Canada what we see is yes, there is an adaptation to do with the Arctic Council. That has been stated by many actors, and Lawrence Cannon has said it also. Now, giving more power to an Arctic Council for it becoming legally binding, I don't think so. That is not something that has been actually envisaged, and we're not going that way. I think the first step is trying to see and talking with indigenous people also during the last years. There is for everybody a need to change this really incredible machine, which is proof of many years of cooperation that works. Like my colleague just said a while ago, it is not political, and it is a forum that is bringing results. Now, for legally binding things, I think bilaterally, multilaterally, states will be able to resolve whatever border or legal issue that there is to resolve. Again, we have to try to understand what is this region transforming like, and what kind of regimes do we want to have, and who will be taking part of these regimes. If we have an internationalized region where only the Arctic states are part of these regimes, and this is a question I'm asking to everybody, to what point non-Arctic states will feel that they are part of these regimes and then respect them and follow through the laws and the constraints and all of the objectives of these. We see it right now in the, close to Greenland waters and in the Beaufort Sea. There is an international presence there. Now, if exploring for natural resources, eventually if we go beyond all of this and we're elsewhere in the Arctic waters, who will be calling the shots here, and who will be following the rules?
Well, Betsy, that's the question. Who do you think it is then? If it's not the Arctic Council.
I think it's the states. I think it's the coastal states primarily. And I think one thing I was attempting to do...
the coastal states, the Arctic Council?
They are, but let me expand a bit on that. If there are neighborhoods in the Arctic, if you will, and if you have strong cooperation in the neighborhoods, that pulls in maybe the neighbors of the neighbors. Daniela referred to, well, maybe we can expand this Norwegian-Russian wonderful cooperation to other parts of Europe and pull in willing participants that way. I think of to get to a moment to science and the possibilities there that are transboundary. So something like the proposed Sustained Arctic Observing Network, which is an effort to build on existing observation points such as the International Arctic Buoy Program, which basically just collects MET data and other data. How do you get scientists, Arctic and non-Arctic, contributing that way to solve problems that are much larger than those only facing the Arctic? The effects of the melting in the north are global, and to understand those and to cooperate on related projects. And I would point out, somebody who couldn't be here today said, well, why don't you ask the question, why would Norway, for example, want to be involved in governing the Mediterranean? Right? I mean, so clearly opposed to having non-Arctic states involved. But I would point out, so the strategy for Arctic environmental protection, which was the precursor to the Arctic Council, it specifically states that it was supported in preparing all of the scientific studies that went into this by the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, the Nordic Sami Council, Germany, Poland, the UK, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, so that there has always been, the Arctic Council itself relies on non-Arctic states. It's sort of a fiction to say that they're not involved in producing the outputs.
All right. Why would Norway want to govern the Mediterranean or have a say in it? And what would the Russian view be of that? Because it seems to me, again, that, and this was it was not my idea, but I thought it wasn't a bad idea when I read it in Foreign Affairs in about 2008. The idea, and it was an American writing it, and the Americans and Canadians are in this room, that the Arctic waters should be seen as something like the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that the United States and Canada control the St. Lawrence Seaway, but every country in the world can use it. Their ships use it if they want to come through, and that somebody has to control it, and the larger the group controlling it, the more difficult it is to have a consensus or to make rules that everyone will agree to. Russia didn't want to expand the Arctic Council. Would Russia want to have, in the same way Norway would govern the Mediterranean, would Italy govern the Arctic or how would the Russians feel about that?
Well, I mean, the reasons, I say for the EU, the question is, I think the EU was pretty stick. Russia already has, very, I wouldn't call it tense, but very uneasy relations with the EU. There's so many, points of cooperation, but it's also, a number of issues, number of issue for tensions, let's say. And there is sort of sometimes a quid pro quo game between Russia and the European Union. They didn't want it to extend it to the Arctic Council. Let's say for obvious, let's say for the European Union at attempt, the EU officials always say what's, yes, Arctic, the High North is governed by UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. I mean, let's say, but they're interested like in environment, etc., etc. I mean, let's say, but for Russia, it's obviously, I mean, let's say, why would you invite the European Union where, I mean, let's say, like, and give European Union substantial powers? I mean, and then complicating which is already complicated game. I mean, and then. Yeah, I mean that was the major issues, but it's also not only EU. I mean, it's, if you see, I mean, basically it's also China, for instance. I mean, China starts to get very interested in the Arctic. I mean, they build a new icebreaker, they send an expedition. I mean, and then, I mean, obviously, I mean, let's say Russians also doesn't want to see Chinese, I mean, let's say, like, go in there, I mean, let's say, like, getting, obviously, I mean, let's say, the more, let's say, like, members you have, a more complex interest you bring. I mean, let's say, right now there is sort of understanding, I mean, let's say, of divergences and the common points. There's a cooperation going on with the US, with Canada, with Norway. I mean, and obviously, I mean, the A5, I mean, let's say, or A8, I mean, let's say, they don't agree on everything, but they sort of already has a model of cooperating. And, like, as for, like, basically, like, resource exploration, everything is clear. But if you start to bring more and more, let's say, more and more participants, I mean, the game would complicate. And then, obviously, you have, I mean, let's say, like, EU, for instance, and Russia cooperate on a number of agendas. And then, if you add Arctic agenda, it will complicate, which is already a complicated game. Same with China, for instance. That was, I mean, one of the reasons. I mean, and right now, in any case, it's too early to say. There is no, I mean, very intensive navigation going on. I mean, let's say it's purely like theoretical discussion for 10, 20 years to come. And say, but that was the reasoning, I mean, or at least my understanding of the reasoning.
I think I'm a Russian. You've explained that to me. Thank you. Danilo was talking about the security concerns the Russians have. And throughout the Cold War, the Arctic, under the Arctic Ocean, was a playground for both the Soviet Union and the United States. Is the Americans' concern still security in the same way, or is it more now resources and navigation?
I think we're definitely in a different era, and security is defined much more broadly than simply competing military interests. That map, and maybe, Laura, if you could put up the maps again, please, that would be helpful. So the International Bathymetric Chart of the Arctic Ocean, we worked I wasn't involved, but the people who prepared it worked very hard with the U.S. Navy, for example, to declassify a lot of data that our submarines had collected under the ice during the Cold War. And that data has been fed into that bathymetric chart, and it provides a lot more information. I can't speak for how forthcoming other militaries were, but I do know that there's an acknowledgement that we have to look beyond sort of those initial. So it's, I think, the fourth map. Next one. There we go. Thank you. And maybe just we can leave that up for reference generally. Acknowledgement that the science that's going on in Russia, that we have some very successful scientific collaborations on a number of issues dealing with sea ice circulation. That if you think of the link I tried to make between environment and security, if we don't understand the natural phenomena there, we're not going to be able to provide, for example, a stable basis for industry. If we don't know what sea ice conditions will be, if we don't know what the geology of the area is where oil is being developed, that raises security issues at a different level.
So when you mentioned security, and you talked about NATO being part, or the possibility of NATO being involved, is that because you see it as a military security threat, or you just see that it expands particularly to the European Union, since quite a few of the members of the European Union are also members of NATO?
Oh, well, NATO is playing, I mean, it's absolutely different game from the European Union. It's quite interesting, actually, what's...
So you see it as a military threat?
It's not a military threat. I think it's an attempt of NATO of getting a new raison d'etre. And it's very interesting, for instance, with a new Secretary General and a lot of, like, Commission officials unofficially complains about it, what Denmark started to block all the EU initiative on the Arctic. Like, and then because obviously it's a Danish who is heading the NATO, and he wants to, like, be Arctic, I mean, let's say Arctic to be like one of the topics of the NATO. For NATO, it's like energy security or cyber security is an attempt of, like, I have impression of the structure losing understanding of its raison d'etre and wanting to develop. But for Russia, it's always a scene, let's say, like, not as direct, it's a military threat because it doesn't change, but as attempt of actually, like, breaking the existing, like, governance status quo is a way of European involvement or China, mostly, like, not as a direct threat, but as governance threat. And when people talk about militarization, security threats, it's a bit exaggeration in the media. Let's say what is real threat is what is considered to be a real security threat is the protection of a borderline. Let's say because in the 20 years it will be like thousands and thousands of kilometers of unprotected borderline, and you have to like actually build a huge infrastructure and see how do you control it. And that's a security concern, but it's a concern shared by Canada or by the U.S. Let's say mostly by Canada and Russia, but yes, also for U.S. It's important thing. It's not really like this like high level like games. The submarines. Which is already over. Let's say, or let's say like almost over.
All right, but Joel, think about this for a moment. You were talking about greater Canada-U.S. cooperation. There's Canada-U.S. defense cooperation in NORAD, which is based on the Arctic, basically. When you're talking about cooperation, are you thinking about NORAD as well, particularly, and if Americans may not know this, but there's a debate now in Canada over acquiring what we call the CF-35, the F-35 for the Canadian Air Force. And a week or so ago, or maybe two now, the Prime Minister alluded to Russian planes approaching Canadian airspace, and this was the reason why we had to spend these billions of dollars for planes out more years than many of us will be alive. So is there a NORAD component in the Canada-U.S. cooperation, or is this really boundaries and resources and keeping the ice out of the shipping lanes?
It's an excellent question because it was the big debate in August. Again, this traditional security threat. And again, let's break with the rhetoric and what's really happening in the region. And like another colleague of mine pointed out, at the same time as this was happening, that these Russian flights were close to North American airspace, which is said by NORAD routine procedures, and many of us in this room know that. There was a similar, or not a similar, but there were exercises going on at the same time or at the beginning of the month of August between Russia, the United States, and Canada in the airspace of Alaska and the far Russian east. So at the same time, some may be using a rhetoric for some political reasons, but at the same time, when we think about NORAD, what is NORAD's role? NORAD has a fundamental role in North America for everything that is airspace security since the beginning of the Cold War. NORAD is trying to adapt now to maybe look at more maritime spaces also. Now, is it possible to have a NORAD in the north? Well, it depends on what time of year and what's happening. If it's winter time, what do we want? What do we want to do? What are we looking for? We're not looking for icebreakers or boats because there's ice everywhere. If we're there in the summertime doing military exercises for exercising our sovereignty, but also training our troops in very difficult areas for intervention or possible intervention in any case scenario, a NORAD, a U.S.-Canada cooperation military at that level is part of the whole dynamic of the U.S.-Canada military relationship that is applied elsewhere, and why would it be different in the north? Again, what time of year and what are we looking for at the same time? If we're looking for Russian bombers trying to conquest or conquer the Canadian North, we're not looking the right way. But if we're looking for some vessel that had to land by emergency, or some vessel that has by accident come into our airspace because needs to land somewhere, that could be useful. But again, the scenarios are all, there's so many we don't even know now, but at least the discussions are there to see how we can adapt to the new security reality.
Just to build on what both of you have said, the security threats are precisely the kind of thing Joel is speaking about, and Daniela makes reference to as well. So even this last month, with all of these groundings, even in Canada alone, on uncharted rocks, one was a tour boat. Nothing happened, but security comes in the form of not having an infrastructure to respond to potentially disastrous circumstances. What if there is even a small leak on an oil platform. Where are our vessels? A research assistant of mine was on a fishing vessel this summer off the coast of Valdez in Alaska. They ran aground. It took the Coast Guard longer than usual to get to them because so many of our vessels were down in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, you aggravate that problem tremendously when sea ice is involved. So thinking about security threats of that nature and security threats of invasive species on vessels transiting the ever-opening Arctic. Security threats of vessels thinking, well, I can make it. I'm not a nice strengthened sailboat, but I'm going to do the Northwest Passage. If you read any document this month, make it be the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment. It provides just fascinating detail. I mean, if you're an expert in the area, it won't teach you anything, but it gives you an overview of the types of issues that we're facing. And crews that aren't trained to navigate in ice. And those, to me, are greater security threats than the traditional Cold War we've been talking about. Not to ignore those. There are still political tensions. But the Arctic, I think, is becoming much more a zone of cooperation or a territory of dialogue, to echo this conference that's going on in Russia as we speak.
Before I open it up to the floor, one more point, and it's about the indigenous people. And Joel, as you know, in our country, in Canada, not just in the Arctic, but all over the country, there's land claims that tie up all sorts of developments and projects. Indigenous people have, in recent years, well, probably the last 20 years, really been taken into consideration much more, and they've organized themselves so that they're taken into consideration even more than probably they were originally intended to be taken into consideration. But in terms of the Arctic and indigenous people in different countries, do you think that the indigenous people are really going to have their concerns considered? And do you think that they have a way beyond, because you were pointing out, one of you was pointing out an agreement, I think it was you, between Inuit people living in different countries. Do you think that that's a real factor, or do you think that at the end of the day progress rolls on, and as Aboriginal people have found, certainly in North America, they tend to get rolled by it?
I think the Inuit people of Canada, who have been doing remarkable work since the 1970s, have gained a voice that they didn't have before, and they are very aware of that now and are working on it. I think, and that's a bit some kind of a point that's brought by this Canadian foreign policy, is dealing also with national issues. And the questions of Indigenous peoples in Northern Canada are brought in this policy, are very prominent. And we acknowledge that there's a lot of work to do. Now, is it again rhetoric, and is there going to be better cooperation between both sides of the question here? That is something that we'll have to see. But at this point, when we're looking at Northern Canada, all across Northern Canada, could it be in Nunavik in Quebec or through the Northwest Territories or elsewhere, the major problems are social issues, social problems. Housing is a huge crisis. So before being scared of Russian bombers, let's look at what's happening in our own north. And I hope Indigenous peoples will be able to be listened and get their message through. I think one big error of Lawrence Cannon in the last months is stating in a conference that defending Canada's sovereignty in the north is not sending dentists, it's sending military people. I think it's le contraire, it's the contrary of that. To build on Canada's north, you need to work with the people who are there and build with them. And we have many Inuit people in the north who are there to do that. We have an exhausted generation that has been working politically very hard for the last 30 years. A new generation is coming up and will take over, and I think that's one of the most beautiful things that we'll be seeing in the next years, seeing these people reinforce their interests in Canada's north.
In your country, in Russia, is...
Unfortunately, it's not as good. I mean, there are like a number of associations of indigenous people, but I don't think they are powerful at all. I mean, what we see is actually like there is a number of like representatives of indigenous ethnic group who joined, who was always part of establishment, for instance, on a quite high level positions, but that's it. I mean, basically, you have like a tiny number of basically of upper classes who goes, I mean, into like national establishment and join it, but the interest of indigenous people, unfortunately, on the ground level, is not being respected. I mean, there's a formal declaration, but in reality, it's like not much happening. And frankly speaking, I don't see this happening. I mean, it's a situation improving, except of possibly Yakutia, because it's a quite large ethnic group. I mean, with I mean, let's say like substantial resources. I mean, substantial financial resources. Other than that, I don't see it's unfortunately I don't see like any positive trends. I mean, happening in the nearest future.
And they don't see themselves as part of a larger group of indigenous people living around the Arctic Circle? And would maybe want to work with people in Canada and Alaska?
They do. I mean, there are organizations, but if you go, I mean, and see those people who are basically part of establishment, no, I mean, they are totally like, they see themselves, I mean, it's as a part of like, they see themselves more as Russians, I mean, let's say like, yeah, there are organizations who cooperate, I mean, let's say, but like people who basically take decisions, who like, you know, like on a really like, high-level positions, they don't really see themselves. I mean, they don't have these attachments. I mean, let's say to their groups.
Betsy, what do you think in terms of indigenous people? Can they work cross-border together effectively? And even is there a common indigenous agenda? Because I think in Canada, some indigenous people resist progress, want to maintain as much of their traditional life as they can, and others tend to see that progress is coming and they want to make sure they get their share of it. So there's not necessarily even a coherent, there's at least two agendas and maybe more.
Well, as I stated earlier, there's not a monolithic position, but I also think it's important to think about how we conceive of progress. And maybe progress is, in fact, maintaining sustainable traditional lifestyles that we can learn something from in the face of change. Yes, of course, the groups can work cross-boundary. The Inuit Circumpolar Council is a good example of that, but also an example of inability to reach agreement on things like a very clear statement regarding climate change. That did not happen in that forum. I think it's important also to recognize that the strongest basis for promoting Indigenous rights is the individual constitutional, or are the individual constitutional protections in each state. Sweden has now, in its draft constitution, or portion of its constitution, is recognizing the Sami as a people rather than as a minority. And that may seem like word parsing, and it is, but it has significant legal distinctions, greater rights for a people than for a minority, if you will. Canada has much firmer protections for its Indigenous populations in its Constitution Act. The U.S. has done it sort of piecemeal. I can't speak to other countries, but maybe our next panel can. So it's a combination of working at the state level. The Alaska Native population has been, I think, quite effective in that regard.
We are down to about the last 10 minutes for this panel. Questions from the floor? You, sir. Oh. It's coming your way. The further back you are in the room, the higher you have to hold your hand if I'm going to see you. This gentleman here, yes.
You gave the impression that global warming has impacted considerably on Arctic management. Could you dwell a little more on what these impacts are and whether the Arctic nations are as concerned about global warming as the rest of the world? Did the Arctic Council have a lobby at Copenhagen?
Well, Betsy, why don't you start on that, and we'll quickly go down the line.
The Arctic Council was behind a groundbreaking study, 2004, with the International Arctic Science Committee, the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. And that really was a clarion call that Arctic change is, that the Arctic is being very vastly affected. Specific to your question about Copenhagen, the Arctic Council was, to my understanding, represented there. I don't know exactly in what capacity, but also its individual member states, and others in the room can expand on that. Specific changes that we see, increased erosion along the coasts, rising waters, species migrating north. The U.S. has put a precautionary approach in its fishery policy for the Arctic region, saying until we know more about the species that are moving north, we are going to hold off on commercial fishing. There are changes in disease, certainly the persistent organic pollutants like mercury working its way through the food chain into Inuit diets, and that causing great health concerns. Black carbon emitted by my wood stove in New Hampshire, for example, having the cumulative effect of black carbon on the melting of the polar ice is proven to be quite substantial. Those are just a few examples. Melting permafrost, so roads collapsing, buildings.
Thank you. I think I'll take that as the answer to the question because we are tight on time. Gentleman over here, yes, with...
Hi. This is a question for Daniela and for Joel. You kind of been dancing around the topic of Russian and Canadian relations within the Arctic Council, but I was curious if you could address that issue more directly. Obviously, there seems to be elements of cooperation, at least as to who they want to keep out. But to what extent is there growing cooperation between these two countries, or are they kind of waiting for the planes to come across the border? I mean, what is the relationship between the two?
Joel, why don't you go first and then Daniela?
Well, just briefly, let's look back on what was going on this week. Lawrence Cannon was in Russia, was discussing with his Russian counterparts. There is a relationship that is there. That is often the relationship is distracted by images of a non-friendly relationship. I think both of them have very similar issues in the north. Looking at geography and everything, they are very similar in the vastness of their territory and their willingness to exercise their sovereignty on these regions. When you look at a map, you can see that at least pretty easily, the parts that are developed and the parts that are not developed. And in northern Canada, it's very not developed in the north. On that issue, on issues of the legal status over the Northwest Passage and the eastern northern sea route, again they have similar, they have the identical positions on that. So again, when you compare both of them and their strategies, they are almost similar. When you look at Russia and Canada's rhetoric, often in national media, you can find this nationalism that is very important. And then on the international scale, they are working together, and that's a fact. And it's been like that for a long time. If not, the Arctic Council wouldn't exist, and they wouldn't be sitting together around the table and discussing other issues.
Another thought on this?
But basically, yes, I fully agree with Joel, but up till now, two countries didn't have that much of a geographical opportunity to work together. I mean, let's say, and I think it's basically I think what we see, I mean, it's 2013, 2014, when would be new submissions to extension of continental shelf, when we see real competition or cooperations going, because right now, I mean, obviously, Russia cooperates with its neighbors, Norway and US. I mean, it's for practical reasons, because that's, I mean, it's actually where it's geographically possible. Yeah, I'm very interested point. I mean, just to add, I mean, it's a number of lawyers, international lawyers who deal with Arctic and in Russia, who are in a position towards official position of a foreign office. They always refers to Canadian positions as, for instance, what Canada is very skillful in asserting its sovereignty using different types of legal mechanisms, for instance, environmental protection as a way of asserting partially your sovereign rights. I mean, that's I mean being said in the critics towards Russian foreign ministry, who always only officially sticks to UNCLOS, etc., etc. I mean, but that's it. I mean, I think in 2013, 2014, when let's say all the data would be submitted, we will see, I mean, let's say a growth of cooperation, because that's a real issue at stake. I mean,
yes, that'll be the test, right? More questions? Down here.
NATO in some regard, but I think that the question of security and a regional security structure has been addressed head on. What role for NATO in the Arctic? You mentioned, do we want Norway engaged in the Mediterranean? Well, NATO is a member of NATO and therefore is engaged in the Mediterranean. So could we potentially see Italy engaged in the high north, there is a potential for that. Article 5 could be called in the high north. So what is the ideal security architecture that should be established? Because while traditional security has shifted and we have a new definition of security in the region, there are still hard security issues. If there's an oil spill, which has been raised, just sort of the border disputes, a range of larger hard security issues. Who will be the one to address it? The Arctic Council at the moment can't address those military issues. Does NATO have a place in the Arctic, and if so, what?
All right, Betsy, I want you to pick that up because you said there's a new definition of security, which is absolutely true. But there's also, as the questioner pointed out, there are old security issues, and if the waters are going to, and some people don't think they are, but if supposing the Northwest Passage was really open, the possibility of piracy, which seems to be growing around the world, could be a possibility, if not right on around the North Pole, at least in the approaches to it. So.
A disclaimer, I am not a NATO expert and actually did not mention NATO. I was the one person who didn't.
That's why you're answering the question now.
So I will defer to my colleagues, but very briefly, to the extent the national governments are involved in NATO, as is the case, the cooperation for things like oil spill response really has to happen at the national and regional infrastructure level. And I will leave it at that because I would otherwise be speaking out of school.
Okay, Joelle, it seems to me that after 9/11, there was an agreement between Canada and the United States in terms of the water approaches to North America, which wasn't NORAD specifically, but it was NORAD-like in terms of the sea as well as the way NORAD protects the airspace. Could you see that being something that would also then be in the Arctic, or do you think that NATO would be the one to play the role?
Well, I think both of you raise something that's very important to tackle on right away. What happens following 9/11 is a coming back of the traditional concept of security and applying it in the North, which is a bit difficult to conceive when you don't really see or think that terrorist activity or terrorist access to the North is an actual possibility today. Just accessing that region needs so much expertise that just getting there is already eliminating the terrorists by themselves, because they won't get there and they have no interest in going there. And I think in our North American perspective, we need to again bring the concept of geography. This is far away territory, and I think the thematic of this meeting today is very interesting because we're talking about the far north. And my colleagues from the Nordic countries in Russia often talk about the high north because this region is completely different. People are living there, and there's roads, infrastructure. The Barents Sea is accessible, navigable almost all year round, or if not year round. It's not the same reality in North America. So let's get back to this security concept and open it. What we need to understand on the security concept in the North today is risk to security. Betsy talked about oil spills and state responses. Who is doing that right now? It's the Arctic Council, and they're working on that, and they're developing governance structures that are extremely important to follow. Then the traditional security risks are always there. There's always a risk, but a traditional threat like it was before, or even a terrorist threat. My dear colleague Rob Hubert wouldn't be happy with me right now, but it is not in a day-to-day dialogue today in the Arctic. Let's not divert the attention to these important issues, but let's bring all the money and the attention to the most pressing issues, which are environmental and local security.
I think we know where you stand on NATO in the North. A very short last question that will prompt a very short answer, I'm sure. Yes, sir. Do you want to wait for the microphone?
Theoretically, all border issues, exclusive economic zones, resources, etc., would be sorted out either through UNCLOS or through bilateral negotiations between the countries involved. If that's the case, assume for a moment that the Arctic Council does at some point authorizes itself to issue binding resolutions. what sort of things could it even do? I mean, I suppose search and rescue and maybe responsibility for environmental cleanup, but isn't the role of the Arctic Council always going to be sort of limited because of the structures that already exist to sort out the most important issues up there?
You've answered your own question and the way I would answer it. And to make clear, when there is murmuring about expanding or even any binding obligations from the Council, it would be for very specific tasks, and they look very much to existing treaty obligations in other structures.
Anyone else want to have a last word on that? Joël?
When we look at the Arctic Council again, and Betsy, if you have any other elements you want to bring to the Arctic Council, maybe you can help me out. But again, what we need to do to the Arctic Council today is reinforce its structure, to give it a permanent secretariat, to give it more funding so it can continue working what the issues are today. On border issues, there are other ways to deal with that. But right now, the Arctic Council has an agenda just of its own, things that needs to be adapted to the new circumstances surrounding this broad idea of climate change in the Arctic.
Vanilla? Last word?
No, it's okay. I fully agree. I mean, there's nothing to add.
Well, if we're going to end on consensus, I can't think of a better way to end. And we're going to end anyway because we've used up all our time. But panel, thank you. You've been enlightening and appreciate your contribution. We're going to take a break and then the second panel is on. We have 15 minutes for coffee and the coffee is